What is up, everybody? Happy draft day. I say it every year, but this is one of, if not the most exciting times to be a fan of the NFL for the sole fact that whether your team has 12 picks and you're like the Packers, Texans, or Raiders, or you are the Miami Dolphins, who only are going to be adding 4 guys to the squad as things currently line up, every team is going to be getting better today, right? But the problem is, of course, is with that said, how much better are you going to get relative to everybody else, right? So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about. Who are the best guys, in my opinion? Who will make your team the most better, right? There's some players that, compared to the national media, I'm certainly a little bit higher on, as well as on the flip side, there are certainly some players that I am lower on. As far as who will I be discussing today, because if you guys have been here for any period of time, essentially what I do is I'll go a little bit deeper at certain positions than say wide. So here today we're going to talk about a total of 98 prospects ranging from rounds 1 to round 7. Obviously, the later you get, things start to taper off. But what positions are they? Just so you have an idea of if your guy is going to even really be touched on, right? Because there are some positions that unfortunately I wasn't quite able to get to even at all, right? So on the year we have 5 quarterbacks included here. We have 18 running backs, 14 wide receivers, 16 defensive tackles, 23 defensive ends, 11 linebackers, and 11 defensive backs. You're going to notice that the great omission there is obviously on the offensive line and in the tight end group. The only reasons I didn't go that deep into those are because, one, don't have unlimited time, and two, those are 2 of the groups that I went really heavy into last year, and I didn't want to keep hitting and leaving out, I should say, the same groups, especially, say, wide receivers, for example, which I was pretty disappointed at last year considering, just some of the names involved that I maybe didn't get around to watching. With that being said, I guess we will hop right in. There's, I think you guys will get the flow of things. There's a couple players that I'll say right now, they're going to be graded where they're at, which is, primarily a film-based grade. And there are going to be some off-the-field concerns, right, that I do not take into account. So some players, even though I have them where I have them, there's going to be a little bit of a notation as to, well, maybe you don't actually take them there. And I guess I'll show you guys the first one right off the bat. I don't know if there's much surprise with this, but Jalen Carter. That's going to be our little symbol for the day. It is the red flag. In that regard, though, I think if you look past the off-the-field issues, which are certainly, certainly not ideal, I think Carter's the most dominant prospect in this draft. Just on a play-to-play basis almost, made the lives of offensive linemen and quarterbacks alike an absolute nightmare, right? He can beat you with his hands. He can beat you with his speed. There's not really much that Carter can't do, and that's why for me, when it just comes to the talent and the film and just how disruptive and impressive he is, he tops my big board at a 90.22 first overall number 1 player grade. Second, and perhaps a bit of a surprise, speaking of disruption, we have Tyree Wilson, the defensive end out of Texas Tech. Perhaps a little bit more raw than others at the position, but the physical traits are there, the athleticism is there, and man, when you put on the film, is he disruptive. Had 7.5 sacks this past season, to the point that, yes, there are other players with more, but it felt like there weren't very many guys in the backfield more than Tyree, whether it was chasing down running backs from the backside or, again, terrorizing quarterbacks with a with a ridiculous bull rush at times, some all right hand usage, and when he used them, they're strong, right? So Tyree, yeah, in that regard, I'm a big fan of him. He can beat you in a variety of ways, and I only expect that number of ways to continue to increase here at the next level. I have him number 2 at a 90.20. Third, we have C.J. Stroud. Now, C.J. is obviously a player that, there's been some interesting discussion about these last few days, especially surrounding this S2 cognition test, right? Like, can he process information? This, that, and the other. Well, it's interesting because I did my grade for Stroud as well as all the other quarterbacks before that news dropped, and in all honesty, those are his 2 lowest grades, right? Poise and decision making. But that said, even with that being said, he still came out to an 89.99. So in that regard, I think I've already taken into account the 2 number 1 things that S2 test would translate to. I don't think that test is able to encapsulate and show how accurate he is with the ball. Not only getting the ball in the vicinity of players for it to be catchable, but the elite precision to which it is catchable, right? For me, there's 2 layers of accuracy here. It's can you make it a catchable ball, and can you make it the easiest frickin' ball to catch? And he did not only the former, but most certainly the latter very well. Solid in terms of arm strength, everything you're looking for in terms of mechanics, and to me, some of the best anticipation of any of our throwers here in the draft. He tops my big board from the offensive side of the ball at an 89.99. Next up, 4th overall, Will Anderson Jr. I don't want to take anything away from him, having him a little bit separated from the top, because unlike those top 2 guys, his statistical production was, was king here over these past 2 seasons. Not much else to say about Anderson. A really smooth, silky athlete who can beat you with his bend. He can just burn you with his speed and quickness. And at times, if you're not careful, he'll hit you with some very solid hand technical usage as well. Do I think it can get better? Yes, but I think by and large, compared to the entire slate of his peers, I have Will Anderson 4th. Next up, Mr. Bryce Young. Young's an interesting prospect because all of the talk about his size, right? For me, I grade size out of 100 points. I give size a measly 5 points of weight, right? So you can say right there that I am not somebody that size matters very much to in that regard, right? Some people are taking Bryce completely off their board because of his size. For me, though, those measly 5 points do make the difference, as you can see. If he was the same player that he is at 6 feet 4 inches tall, I do think he is, for me, the number 1 player on my board. That said, he's not. He gets a 1 out of 5 on size, and that might even be generous. That does pull him back to an 87.86, but really crafty in the pocket. Does a great job throwing from a variety of arm angles, off-platform throws, can evade, just about anybody in the pocket, and do a good job keeping his eyes downfield doing it. I like Bryce Young. I'm not scared to take him number 1 overall, but when we fill out the grade, the grade sheet here that I've created, I think that you have to take something away from size, and even if it's something as measly as a couple points, that just changed the order up quite radically. Next up, Devin Witherspoon, cornerback out of Illinois. One of the most physical and aggressive guys in the entire class. I didn't get to watch a ton of cornerbacks, but of the class that I watched, he was the cream of the crop, right? Had some solid ball skills. He had good reactionary quickness, in my opinion. Almost maybe some shades of, say, a J.C. Horn, but I have him graded even higher than I did Horn coming out in that regard. I think and would say that he's perhaps even a little bit more balanced as far as being able to cover both in man and zone. Not the perfect prospect necessarily. I think at times, you wish he was perhaps a little bit more fluid of an athlete, but by and large, positive grades to go around for Witherspoon there. He is my 6th highest overall player. 7th. And you see there's a big drop there, right? I would say that of the guys I watched, those top 6 are very high grades, right? They would almost be the top 6 players if we went to last year's draft. Obviously, Aiden Hutchinson would have something to say. I was very high on Evan Neal last year, and I wouldn't take anything away from that. Or even if you go the year prior, right? The Kyle Pitts of the world, Rashawn Slaters of the world, Micah Parsons, all those guys. These 6 would almost, they would be maybe 4 out of the top, or I should say 6 out of the top 8, for example, or 6 out of the top maybe 10, right? I do think the talent at the very top of this draft is strong. That said, I think this gap right here is maybe where things start to drip off a little bit and where other drafts have potentially been stronger. But that's not taking away anything from this man, my wide receiver 1, Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think if he did play this past season more than obviously the 3 games, there's a chance he might be even higher. Just a little bit tougher guy to project now. But when it comes to what he's able to do on the football field, can just have a positive impact in a variety of ways. Maybe he's not going to beat you flat out with his straight line speed, but we saw it at the combine as far as the quickness is concerned, which is just next level. Has a good understanding of route running and things of that nature, and is not afraid to haul in the ball over the middle, or can even beat you over top at times, depending on the defensive look. So with that said, I have Jackson Smith-Njigba 7th at an 82.24. Next up, we have Christian Gonzalez, the cornerback out of Oregon, who is an interesting prospect. I do think there is a bit of a gap between him and Witherspoon. Not saying that I don't like Gonzalez, but as you can see, 83.60 rather than 87.26 is a pretty sizable difference. I just don't quite think that he's maybe as refined in either area, man or zone. I think he is a more fluid athlete, and I think that's the reason you're drafting him. Instead of maybe, say, Witherspoon, who I think should be able to step in right away and wow you against the run and have success, whether it's in press or in zone, or I think Gonzalez might be a little bit more of a project, but he has exactly what you're looking for and checks all the boxes as far as size and athleticism and the fluidity and quickness and speed are concerned. Didn't rate quite as highly as far as his ball skills or obviously in run support, but I do think he's a very solid option here as my number 2 rated defensive back at an 83.60. Next up, maybe a little bit of a surprise. I have Jordan Addison seemingly much higher than the national media seems to have him. Yes, I realize he's a little bit of a smaller guy, but I think people who are just using that to fall back on aren't looking at how big he plays and how physical he plays and how just how determined he is to get open. And even when he's not open and with the ball in his hands, he is putting it on the line and blocking for others. I'm a really big fan of Addison in that regard. Maybe didn't quite rate as highly as far as his speed and quickness is concerned, but right at the top of the class as far as route running, tracking and body control, as well as his release off the line, let alone, of course, the physicality, despite being a guy that is only, say, 5'11", 173 pounds. I like Addison quite a bit, and even though we're kind of at that point now where I'm not necessarily saying I would advocate for him going 9th off the board, because there are players I didn't watch. I think whoever gets him in the teens or perhaps even 20s is getting quite the steal here on Thursday night. Next up, fun player to watch. He's an absolute flamethrower off the edge. Nolan Smith, the defensive end out of Georgia. Probably going to line up a little bit more as an outside linebacker, as a stand-up guy. But you can line him up however you want. You just want that fiery speed and athleticism coming off your edges in 2023. There are some questions about him against the run, as well as he's just coming off of a torn pectoral muscle. So there are some questions in that regard. Not enough to warrant the red flag, in my opinion, but did just want to mention that I don't think he's the perfect prospect, right? If you watch the combine and the aftermath of that, you might say, oh, he should be the number one guy. Well, I do think there are some flaws in his game, but for me, a very solid 83.35 grade, and ultimately someone that I wouldn't mind in the top 10, but I don't really love to get a few picks later, right? Next up, a little bit of a surprise here, B.J. Ojulari, the defensive end out of LSU, whereas he doesn't have quite the level of athleticism that, say, a Nolan Smith has. I feel like Ojulari is the technician of the class, taking someone after his brother Aziz. I'm a big fan of him in that regard, just the understanding of, the art of pass rushing, and for me, just held up a little bit better in some areas than, say, a Nolan Smith, right? They come out equal here on the big board. I think it's obviously more likely that Smith comes off first just due to the athleticism and the burst and the high ceiling, but I tend to think that Ojulari has one of the higher floors of this draft, and obviously we're getting to the end of my first round grades, as you can see in the dark blue. But if Ojulari is a guy who's available in round 2, I think you are getting yourself a steal. For me, just a guy who has, everything you're looking for as far as bend. I gave him an 8.75 out of 10 as far as his hand usage was concerned, particularly as a pass rusher. I thought really impressive there. Again, some questions as far as an ability to set the edge and things of that nature, but a high motor, good as far as his finishing and tackling is concerned. I'm a big fan of B.J. Ojulari here this draft season. Next up, player that most tend to have above Ojulari, Lucas Van Ness. And maybe the polar opposite as a player, right? He's solidly refined as well, but just different. He's different from pretty much everyone, though, just in terms of how powerful and tough of a guy he is. Has a hockey background, which is rather interesting, but he's almost more of a hand in the dirt guy / inside defensive tackle than he is someone like Ojulari, who's probably going to make his money standing up. Van Ness has some solid hand placement, though, and isn't going to wow you, but could and should be a solid piece on your team's defensive line for years to come. I have him 12th here with an 83.08. Next up, a bit of a surprise. He is my running back 1. I have Jahmyr Gibbs. Probably not the most popular choice. I know there's a lot of love for our man from Texas, who we'll touch on shortly. But I think Jahmyr, he's being underrated as a runner. I think he's being properly rated as a receiver. But for me, he is just, I said it in his individual video that I recorded. He is electricity personified. He is an absolute lightning rod. I said Nolan Smith was a flamethrower off the edge. Well, he's the closest thing to a flamethrower out of the backfield. A threat to legitimately take the ball 100 yards to the opposite end of the field every single time he touches it. I have Jahmyr at an 82.72. And don't sleep on his vision. I'll say that, right? I have not given a running back a first-round grade in my 3 years on the channel, and since I really adapted this grade scale, I think that says something as far as just where I think Jameer is headed, especially if he goes at the end of the first round there and can get behind a solid offensive line. Next up, 14th, Bryan Bresee, defensive tackle out of Clemson. If you asked me a year ago where I thought he would be, it seemed as though he would be someone in that top 5 discussion. But, another injury-riddled, just tough campaign for him. He's a number 1 recruit coming out of high school per his graduating class, and does some stuff really solid, and is one of the more balanced defensive tackles in this draft. I think he's still deserving of a first-round grade, although I will say it's not without some consistency issues and questions about can he remain on the field, and at times questions about his motor. He got just slightly one of my lower motor grades of the class, and ultimately for me is the guy that I would feel most comfortable taking towards the end of the first round, but depending on how strong the rest of this class is, might sneak his way up by necessity. I have Bryan Bresee there at an 82.65. Keeping in Clemson, we have Myles Murphy, Bryan Bresee's running mate in a sense. Their edge rusher, I think he's a very solid player. I don't think some of the top 5, top 10 discussion was particularly warranted. Unlike Bresee, who I think maybe does have that physical talent, Myles' somewhat descent through the process, I think, has, I don't want to say made less sense, because unlike Bresee, who did have, who he was on and off the field, when he did play, he did produce at a certain level. Myles maybe didn't. So in that regard, I think, the traits are solid. He can impact your defense positively, both as a run defender and pass rusher, but I do think there are some questions about just how high the ceiling is compared to some of these other pass rushers. He narrowly squeaks in with my first round grades here at an 82.55, and ultimately you're going to ask where would I feel comfortable taking him. I think at this point I would say Myles is someone, if you assume all the other guys that I didn't grade that are being talked about in the top discussion should be there, I would say Myles in the early to mid 20s makes the most sense, right? And then some of these next couple names would then fill up the latter positions of the first round. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. I like Myles. I don't think he's, again, somewhat similar to Van Ness. I don't think he's someone who is necessarily going to change the direction of your franchise, but I do think he's someone who could be a very solid secondary pass rusher on your team, and maybe at one point he'll develop into the primary number 1 guy, but I think for right now I feel most comfortable saying he will be a dang good number 2. Next up we have Zay Flowers, the wide receiver out of Boston College, who earns my top 2nd round grade of the draft class. Really like, of course, the speed, the acceleration, things of that nature with Zay. The athletic traits are most certainly there, although I do have some questions about maybe more of the physical traits, right? I thought one of the more questionable abilities to get off the line of scrimmage, abilities to defeat press, I only gave him a 5 out of 10 on release, and that's one grade that's certainly weighing him down, mixed with some questions as far as contested catches are concerned. Not that he doesn't have any, but he's more of a grounded speedster than he is necessarily someone who is going to climb the ladder and beat you at the point of attack. That said, really solid route runner and some good track and body control nets him my highest grade of all these second rounders that I handed out this year, 81.90. Secondly, Joey Porter, 81.77. Again, another guy who I certainly expect to go in the first, and I don't necessarily have a problem with it. Just an uber physical corner that I think maybe leaves a little bit to be desired with his technique and maybe isn't the most fluid guy in the world, but if you're running a press man scheme and you just want someone who is going to who's going to go out there and disrupt things, Porter's your guy. That said, he's not someone that I'd look to shut down an entire side of the field. I think he'll give up his fair share of touches, but the good reps look really good. I just think there's some question about how the other reps look as far as why he's, for me, more of a second-round grade than a first. Next up, perhaps a bit of a surprise, but I have Hendon Hooker 18th overall, but really an 81.74, yielding my third highest second-round grade. Strong arm, poised in the pocket, unfazed by rushers. Really good in that regard. Solid as far as accuracy is concerned. There's a lot to like with Hendon. I think what's not to like with Hendon is really the root of that red flag. He's an older prospect, 25 years old, coming off an ACL injury. Makes him a tough guy to project. That said, I do think age is a little bit more something I'm lenient on at the QB position, because a good one can play till he's 40. Whereas, say, a running back, if you're coming out and you're 24, well, Muhammad Ibrahim, you might only get one contract. So I'm a little bit more stringy and concerned about it at other positions than I am quarterback. But I think when it comes to the film and just the traits that I'm seeing, I have Hendon here third of the class at an 81.74. Solid player, but not someone that I'm running up to take I'm running the card up to take necessarily, say, in the top 10 or 5th, according to Mike Tannenbaum. No chance for me. A little bit lower, and depending on how you answer those questions about his age, about his injury, things of that nature, even the offense he was in, which was a little bit questionable down there at Tennessee, might go a little bit lower than even where I have him here. So second round grade, I think that's probably the best spot for him. I also think that's probably the best spot for the next man, even though he is most certainly not going there. I realize that as a draft community, we overuse the term generational, but Richardson does have generational athleticism. And that's coming in a generation with guys like Lamar Jackson, guys like Cam Newton even. Richardson is that caliber of athlete. I wasn't even quite as harsh on maybe some of the areas that I thought I was going to be. Going into his film, I had heard so much about not only the accuracy, right? The completion percentage is not good. I get it. But I think to get an accuracy figure that low, you have to be a bad decision maker, right? You have to maybe not be poised in the pocket, right? And I did think Richardson, in fact, checked those boxes. So perhaps even a little bit more highly than I expected to grade him. He's a player that I'm not opposed to taking. I like him. Do I think top 5 is a little bit of a reach? Sure. But for me, he's somebody that it seemed like for a minute there, people were talking about in that sort of Malik Willis bucket, but I have him a round and a half more highly graded than I had Malik last year. I thought he was more impressive as far as the poise, the decision making, the arm strength in particular. Some of the other traits are a little bit more questionable, but the mobility, of course. I thought he was just so solid in those regards. They sort of hold up the other grades as far as the accuracy and the field vision and the anticipation and occasionally mechanics and footwork, right? So a little bit of a polarizing prospect. You hate to throw around the label boom bust before the draft even happens and you know where they go, but I would say if anybody's going to get it, it's going to be Richardson. And I think the ideal spot for him is somewhere where he can use his legs in the interim while his arm catches up, if that makes any sense at all. Personally, I have him mocked going to the Titans, staying put and getting him at 11, but if you trade up and get him, you're just staking your claim, right? You're putting your flag in him, and I don't hate it. I just think you're a team who maybe values the QB position more than I do, right? As far as a position premium and awarding points essentially based on what he plays rather than how he plays it, if that makes any sense at all. Next up, a little bit of a surprise guy here for me. Not someone that I knew a ton about prior to getting the film on. Josh Downs, the wide receiver out of North Carolina. He's someone that isn't going to be for everybody and is probably not going to be an outside receiver necessarily at the next level, but someone for me that I thought really impressed as far as the route running was concerned. Has some really nice speed, but for me, particularly soft hands and an ability to catch the ball at a higher rate than almost anybody in the class with I was going to say relative ease, but it was effortless, right? I was very impressed with him and what he brings to the table. Maybe a little bit more questionable again as far as some of the release is concerned, the blocking physicality is concerned, and certainly the size. But I like Josh Downs and am not opposed to taking him at the top of the second round, if not potentially even higher, depending on how all those ungraded guys see fit. He's there at my number 20 spot. Next up, Big Tuli. I don't know if I want to butcher the last name. It's particularly tough when you're watching all 22 film on guys for 6 months and there's no commentary, right? Not that that's a bad thing. I think that's probably a good thing. But at the same time, you're saying the name one way in your head for a long while before you hear it, and Tuli is a good example of that. Tui Puluto, right? I know he's related to Marlon, who came out a couple of drafts ago, but just a very solid player. Someone who was listed heavier than I thought he played. I thought he had good burst and could make a difference as both a pass rusher and a run defender. He's someone that I think if you miss out on those top guys, as far as the Tyrees and Wills and obviously, even the Nolans and guys of that nature are concerned, I think he could be a dang good option for you in the second round. Really impressive as far as the ability to anchor, deconstruct blocks, a high motor guy. A lot to like here with Tuli at an 81.24. And for me, just the epitome of a very solid second rounder that, again, I wouldn't necessarily even be opposed to taking round one. Someone I probably would be opposed to taking round one, but it's inevitable to happen. We have Bijan Robinson, the running back out of Texas. And I don't mean to rag on him. I think, to me, though, a lot of the traits that everyone has as an A or an A plus for me are a little bit closer to a B minus, A minus, right? And I'm not saying that he's horrible in any way, right? That's still a phenomenal grade point average. But for me, just comes out a little bit lower than he seemingly does for most. I do question, a lot of people say he's a great receiver. He's incredibly talented there. And I question some of that as far as the third down utility is concerned. I didn't see that on film. Personally, could make some flashy catches, but the volume and reps just weren't there game over game. So for me, a very good runner. The same grade that I gave previously my highest graded runner, Travis Etienne. So I do think he's a good player. Do not get me wrong. I just think in this draft class, I'm a little bit more interested in Jahmyr Gibbs personally. But that might just be me, frankly. He's someone that I'll be excited to watch at the next level. Tied with Bijan, also at an 81.20, is Quentin Johnston. All the physical traits are there. You don't need me to tell you. He has the makeup of a number one wide receiver, but I don't quite know if he has the demeanor. Just not nearly as aggressive at the catch point as I think I'd like for a guy his size, as well as had some issues with drops and whatnot that I think are concerning. That said, I thought was a better route runner than people are giving him credit for, albeit not great. But I thought really where he impressed me the most perhaps was with his releases off the line of scrimmage and being able to get off of press, right? Because a lot of these bigger body guys, even though they have the strength to do it, they don't have that short area quickness and burst. But Quentin did have that, and I thought it aided him really well as far as being able to get open, especially on some quick routes underneath, say the slants, drags, things of that nature when he was being pressed up. So Quentin, I like him, but I do think there's some questions that just narrowly keep him out of the first round here, still at a solid grade, 81.20. Next up, Zach Charbonnet. I said it in my individual video for him that if it's not out, it'll be out by the time the sun goes down today, I suppose. He had the most fun film of anybody, in my opinion, in this draft class. I don't even know how to describe it to someone who hasn't seen it. People toss around that he's a bowling ball, he's a wrecking ball. Charbonnet's all of them rolled up, balled up into one, and he's going to frickin' plow you over. Just an absolute treat to watch. So fun on film. Such an enjoyable film session to the point that I kept coming back to it. Days I'm having a bad day, what do I want to do? Probably watch some more Zach Charbonnet. Just an incredible player in that regard. 80.69 might even be too low. Doesn't have the high-end speed that you might be looking for, though, that out of a first-round running back and someone that you take right there out of the gate at the second round. But for me, anything past that, and he is most certainly on the table. Charbonnet is so fun. Next up, Keely Ringo. A little bit less fun. You have a guy who has all the physical tools, all the athletic traits that you'd like, but just didn't quite put it together. That said, I think he's maybe one of the better cornerbacks, at least off the bat, that could play zone coverage for your team. If you're looking to run more of a cover 2 or cover 3 scheme, I think Keely might just be your guy. Now, how early do you have to run up and take him? I'm not entirely sure. He's a guy who I think might be in play as early as, say, the New York Giants in the first round, but could find himself falling as late as the middle to even late second from what I've seen elsewhere. So Keely's a bit of an enigma in that regard. I think a solid player, but someone who does still have some things he most certainly needs to clean up to, really live up to the athletic and physical traits that he possesses, but a solid player and someone I have as my 25th overall of the guys I watched here in 2023. Next up, Derek Hall. Talk about toughness and some solid, just some solid production as both a pass rusher and a run defender. Hall is a really intriguing guy that I like and think I might have graded a little bit too low even. He's just someone that felt like he was making an impact, not every play, but every play that he could, right? Every play in his direction, it felt like he was doing something positive that was checking a box for me. I like him quite a bit. Again, he's another guy like Thule that if you miss out on those top guys, I don't mind Derek Hall in round 2 there out of Auburn at an 80.18. Very fun player to watch on film. Less of a fun player to watch on film. Will Levis. I'll be honest with you guys. I think he's the worst of the 5 main quarterbacks, and it astounds me that people are talking about him going second overall. I don't see it. And frankly, if quarterback wasn't the most valuable position, he would be graded much lower than this, right? When you compare raw grades, because I'm giving QBs a 6.5% boost by comparison, he is lower as far as his raw grade is concerned than the next 8 or 10 guys. But because the position he plays, it almost artificially boosts him up. And yes, it's doing that for Stroud and Young and Richardson and Hooker as well. But I think with Levis, it's a little bit more egregious because he's to the point where I don't know if I put a premium on the position at that point, But it is what it is. Everyone says the physical traits are there, and I see them in that regard. Good athleticism, but I was not impressed with whether it be the poise in the pocket, the anticipation on his throws, the field vision most notably, as well as the accuracy, and really we're touching on everything that you want out of a quarterback outside of a strong arm. I think he, to me, is of the 5 quarterbacks that I watched, he's number 5, and he's the biggest project of the group. Not saying he can't succeed, but I'd feel much more comfortable as a GM getting him in round 2 than pick 2. Next up, Calijah, someone who you guys probably think I'm a little bit too low on, but is someone that I think people are maybe overlooking the weaknesses too much for. They're seeing the flashy speed, faster than Donald, went to the same school as Donald. You're getting overwhelmed by all this Donald, and you're overlooking the fact that Calijah really struggles when offensive linemen get hands on him. Now, is that every play? No, because he is so freaking fast and fun to watch in that regard. But once they get the paws on him, it's a wrap on Calijah in that regard. Good player, but someone I think, might have to get off the field on a critical 3rd and short. Or, you're behind in a game and a team is trying to just pound it down your throat. Well, I think if you're facing, say, Derrick Henry in Tennessee, they are just pointing at Calijah and running down his gap every time, right? I think he's just a little bit too much of a liability against the run to find himself in round 1 for me. Do I hate it because the upside? I don't, but I'd rather wait. I really would rather wait. I don't think every defensive tackle class has to be, the most strong at the top. I don't think there has to be multiple first rounders. So for me, I think if you just call it at Jalen Carter and, Brian Brzee to an extent and let Calijah go in round 2, I think that might be best for your team. A good player, but I think he has a lot of stuff he needs to clean up before he's, let alone Aaron Donald, even say a Grady Jarrett or someone of that echelon, right? I think a little bit overblown as far as the combine numbers are being perceived. Next up, speaking of some good combine numbers, we have Jack Campbell. Now, Campbell is my linebacker 1. I didn't get around to watching some of the other interesting guys at the top, as far as, say, a Trenton Simpson is concerned. I started grading him. It didn't quite finish, and I wanted to get this video ready and prepared as early as possible. So I might grade him and finish him and others by the time, we get to the point they're selected. But in the interim, I should mention Dayon Henley as well in there. I did not get a chance to grade either. So with that said, kind of that next crop of guys, even if we just mark those as unknowns, Campbell was my linebacker 1. Linebacker is not very strong in this class, I'll be honest. I don't think it's horrible. I do have some other options here in the second round, but I think Campbell is the most maybe well-rounded and ready to compete in a variety of areas, right? He's got prototypical size for the position, but he has modern speed, right? He looks like someone who you would have been drafting in the first round 10 years ago, but he runs like someone and is an athlete like someone that you'd see at the top now, perhaps, I should say, as well as brings the hammer as far as coming down and making plays in the hole. Is, for me, the most physical linebacker and very solid as far as his block shedding is concerned. Not quite as comfortable in coverage, but can still get the job done and showed off some impressive ball skills from time to time back there for Iowa. He is my 29th player and someone that I'd feel really good about getting solidly in that second round. Speaking of, Keanu Benton, someone that when I graded wasn't really on the map seemingly, but now is starting to get a push late here to the point that I even saw Daniel Jeremiah had him going to Cincinnati at the end of the first round in his latest mock draft. Keanu really can do it all. He's incredibly impactful as a pass rusher, which is interesting as someone who's playing almost exclusively either as a nose or a one technique, but he's no slouch against the run either. Maybe going to do a better job winning with his quickness against the run than he is, say, some incredible ability to anchor. I did have to knock some points off there, especially for more of a nose tackle. I think he fits better though as a one technique in a 4-3 at the next level, and as someone that personally I would want on my team in the second round. I think he's a very intriguing player that, again, if you ask me the opportunity cost of, hey, do you want Brazil in the first or wait a little bit, get someone else and Keanu in the second, I mean, now we're talking, right? I think he is a really solid player here that I'd really like to get in the 30s or 40s. Very solid player and a very fun one to watch on film. Next up, we have Moro Ojomo, the defensive tackle out of Texas, who is someone I imagine most of you aren't familiar with. He's someone who hasn't been getting a ton of, second round discussions, so this grade might seem a little bit out of left field, but I was really impressed with multiple guys in that Texas front seven this year. Just seemingly very well coached. Ojomo is an interesting case because he got to the University of Texas when he was only 16 years old, played 5 years in college, so has has that redshirt senior experience in a 21-year-old body, which is a fascinating combination. Grew up in a college weight room, and in that regard, I think is one of the most slept-on prospects in this draft class for me. Again, tied with Benton at 78.78, but someone I'd feel comfortable taking in the second round. But hey, if you're going to let me get him in the third, God forbid the fourth, you better watch out, because I really like the impact that Ojomo makes both as a pass rusher and run defender for Texas, and I suspect for my NFL team or whoever gets him, right? Very fun watch and a very intriguing player from my perspective here this weekend. Next up, another sleeper to an extent for me, Jartavis Martin, the safety out of Illinois. Again, I didn't get around to, as you can imagine, all the top guys. As you saw, no Brian Branch, for example. But at the same time, in what's being heralded as a relatively weak safety class, I thought Jartavis did a pretty dang good job, I should say, in coverage, right? Getting ahead of myself here. It's pretty rare that you have someone who can play free safety as well as he can, but also can just man up with a slot wide receiver as well as he can. And in that regard, does he check all the boxes? No, but I think Jartavis might be a little bit of a sleeper as we get into, whether it's late day 2 or even early day 3. He's someone that I think I'm higher on than the consensus here at a 78.66 grade. Probably a player I'm a little bit lower on, Keon White, defensive end out of Georgia Tech. Good athlete, but I don't think it always shined through on film. I thought what did shine through was how stout he was against the run, how good he was as far as the stacking and shedding and just the technical elements of the game are concerned. Really good in terms of his hand placement. You see it there with the picture. I picked it by design, obviously. And strong, once he gets the hands in your chest, it's going to bench press you off and then look to make a play with that created space. Very good in that regard. I don't know how he's going to translate as a pass rusher, and he is a little bit of an older prospect as well, so some questions there. Not enough to give him the red flag, quite in my opinion, but he's someone that I would just not expect to have on my team if I was the GM and had him graded here. He's actually invited to the draft, which is interesting. Not someone that I looked at as a surefire first rounder regardless either, even in the national consensus. So an interesting case there, but I wouldn't be shocked if he goes off the board late, say to maybe Philadelphia, right, at pick 30. Next up, Nathaniel Dell, the wide receiver out of Houston. And he's another guy where the production last season, I would say, caught people off guard, most certainly myself included, but was impressive nonetheless, right? And someone who has been climbing up boards throughout the entirety of this process. I thought he was a good route runner. I should say, a great route runner almost at times. And a good athlete as far as the speed and quickness is concerned. Very solid in terms of his hands, his consistency, the tracking, the body control. Maybe a little bit less so again, getting off of press. And the size is a concern, but I like Nathaniel Dell, especially into day 2 here with that 78.26 second round grade. Very solid player and someone I'd be looking to supplement an already dominant receiver with. There's a lot of discussion about what, say, a Minnesota's going to do to replace Adam Thielen, and are they going to, leap at a guy like Addison or Quentin Johnston in the first round. And if it's Addison, I get it. Otherwise, I think I would probably just try and wait for Nathaniel Dell. Otherwise, for example, I think has a very interesting skill set and can thrive, especially if you have him going up against CB2s and 3s at the next level. Oh, brother, number 35, Felix Anudike-Uzomah. One of the grades I feel the worst about. He's somebody that every single time I put the film on again and again and again, I kept on moving up his grade. My first cut grade was not very high, but it felt like every subsequent one only got higher. Pretty balanced as far as how impactful he was as a run defender or pass rusher. Kansas State, for some bozo reason, we're lining him up as a 3 technique and a 4-eye, which is not at all where he's going to play, because he is, a solid speed rusher, and when he gets the chance, he can make an impact out there. Honestly, and he is a guy who also, I should mention, is 21 years old. Opposed to the red flag guys, if there were any individuals that we were just going to boost because of their traits and their age and things of that nature, Felix would be a green flag guy. He's someone that I have a sneaky suspicion is going to be off the board at the end of the first round. And honestly, I don't hate it. I think he might be a little bit of a project, but maybe not as much as I initially thought, which is why I've kept on having to increase his grade. Very solid player and someone that I think could make not only an initial impact, but could certainly continue to improve and refine his skill set and work on all of his negatives, which just so happen to be some of the most teachable things. And in that regard, a grade that, like I said, might even still be too low for Felix. I do really like him and wouldn't be shocked if he's gone by the time Kansas City turns in their pick there at 31. So solid player, 78.07. Next up, as far as somebody who is almost certainly going to be there at the end of round 1, 2, potentially 3, and who knows after that, we have Keandre Coburn, the nose tackle out of Texas, who is, as I said with Ajomo, is another one of those Texas defenders that I just like a lot. A lot of times nose tackles struggle to post many counting stats and make an impact otherwise. Coburn felt like that rare example of someone who not only did his job clogging gaps, but also could supplement that with some solid hand usage and violent pass rush reps, right? So do I expect him to be a double-digit sack guy? By no means, but he's someone that really is my nose tackle number 1 if you do look at Benton, in fact, as a single gap penetrator. So Coburn's a guy I'm interested in. He's someone that I've seen sites having go as late as the 4th and 5th round. So someone that, to me, even if you don't take him right here, in the late second, he's someone that I still think could be just flat out a great value for you into the 3rd or potentially even 4th round. Very fun player to watch. And if you're running a 3-4 and need a nose, I would not look past Keandre Coburn out of Texas. Next up, Noah Sewell. Obviously the brother to Penei, and someone who is an interesting guy, right? 12 months ago, if you were to look ahead a year and project where he was going to go, it would have been almost certainly top 10, just like his brother. But a pretty lackluster 2022 campaign has seen him dropping on boards, and I can't say I don't get it. I do to an extent, but at the same time, I wonder if we're going a little bit overboard. I think there are still some very solid traits. Maybe not, maybe not going to wow you with his athleticism, but will impress you with his block shedding, the IQ and awareness at times, the finishing and tackling. I thought he was a solid player, and someone who might need a little bit more time to develop, but I think could and very well should turn into a solid starter at the next level. Someone that I like but don't love here at the end of the second round, and would say that if you can get him into the third or fourth, or heck, I think PFF has him graded into the fifth, he might be someone you're better off waiting, but he's someone that I think, regardless, could be an interesting developmental piece there, wherever you're able to get him, essentially. Next up, in the final of my second round grades, we have none other than Mike Morris. Maybe not who you expected there, but dang, is this guy a load to handle for tackles. Massive size and strength off the edge nets him some of the highest grades I could ever give as far as an ability to anchor, an ability to set the edge, the block deconstruction are concerned. Very impressive in that regard, and really just looks the part of an NFL athlete. And even though maybe there's some questions about the high-end athleticism, I just think if you're looking to plug and play a guy, someone who can just use his hands and control tackles and make plays even as a rookie, I think Mike Morris is your guy. Was a very fun player to watch, and a bit of a unicorn, but someone that I think played his role very well. Mike Morris, the defensive end out of Michigan. Fun guy to watch, 77.54. Speaking of fun to watch, the third Texas Longhorn defender in this group of 10 here, and someone that, again, I think might be a little bit underrated. I have DeMarvion Overshawn. Maybe, I shouldn't even say maybe, he's going to slot in more likely as a will linebacker than a Mike at the next level. But I was just really impressed by some of the athletic intangibles as well as the playmaking ability. I gave him really high marks as far as his range and pursuit, his coverage skills, as well as his motor and quickness and change of direction, right? Really anything you're looking for in that regard out of a modern linebacker, I think DeMarvion has it. Are there some questions about his ability to get off blocks? At times finish and tackle, right? Because he's even going to be smaller than some backs that he's going up against. Yes, there were questions. So I have him here as my highest third round grade, because even though there are those questions, I don't quite think there's as many as others seem to think. I like Overshawn quite a bit, especially if you're a 4-3 team looking for a will linebacker of the future. Fun player to watch. Next up, staying at the linebacker position, Henry Tuatu. And I might be pronouncing it wrong, but he is a fun player regardless. An instinctual guy, to an extent, at least I should say. Maybe not a top tier grade, but I thought still, passable in that regard. But where he really impressed me this year were his coverage skills. I started grading him over the summer and had him about a round lower than I do now, mainly because of that facet of his game. I just felt made great strides from 21 to 22, and is a solid player really all around, right? I'm just looking at my grade sheet here, and besides block shedding, there's, as well as maybe size, there's not a ton of negative grades here for Henry. So another guy that you might be able to get around later, but I think you're getting some very solid value here as he, again, is towards the top of my third round grades. And a fun player to watch that surprised me a little bit. I didn't expect to be as high on him as I was coming out of the summer, but good, solid player that I think does have a chance to just supply some solid reps for your team going forward. Next up, speaking of solid reps, Isaiah Foskey. Again, another guy like Noah Sewell who even 6 months ago was talked about in that top 20 discussion. I don't quite see that level of ability, but I think he's just a solid player with some interesting versatility, has some experience off ball, still working on refining his pass rush tool belt, but is a high motor guy, and just a solid player that I think can make an impact on your team going forward. Do I ever expect him to be your number one rusher? No, but I would say he is kind of that next tier of guys where, again, if you missed out on a top pass rusher and maybe even missed out on that second wave, maybe of some more stout run defenders like, say, Thule, for example, and Derek Hall, I think Foskey is a solid round 3 alternative out of Notre Dame there. Next up, if you want a third-round talent, you can have Brenton Cox. You also might have some locker room issues, right? I'm just going to say it. He was kicked off of Florida, had issues in the past as well. It's not ideal ever when a guy can't finish their final season of college football, but usually it's due to injury, not getting kicked off the team, right? So a red flag to the highest of levels in that regard, but at the same time, a very solid player. You know, you put on that Utah tape, and even though he was inconsistent, you know, from game to game, put on that Utah tape and tell me that's not first-round stuff. I think there's flashes to the point that if he can reel it in, you could be getting a really good value wherever he ends up going. I just might be scared to take him if it's much earlier than, say, the 5th round, right? That's how steep of a drop we might be talking about with the red flag. Someone that I think you're going to have needed to, you know, acquaint yourself with quite well in the pre-draft interview process and, you know, almost talk yourself down on as far as some of those negatives and off-the-field concerns are concerned. But when it comes to on the field, I thought there were certainly flashes of even greatness at times, and is a guy that, personally, I had a third-round grade on there at a 75.43. Next up, Jalen Hyatt, someone I'm a little bit lower on than the consensus. It seems not a bad player by any means, but someone who I have questions about, right? As far as, you know, really a litany of areas, but most notably, again, it comes back to the release. A smaller, not a smaller guy because he is tall, but a thin guy, a wiry guy, a lanky guy. And in that regard, while he does grade highly in most categories, the number one is speed and quickness, right? Far and away, no question. But past that, there's a lot of solid grades, and then there's the one really low grade, really two, I suppose I should say, as far as release and blocking and physicality are concerned. I don't know if you're getting him to be a blocker, but you are getting him to be someone who can take the top off the defense. I just have questions about how much more he's going to offer than that. I have solidly in the 3rd round here. If you get him higher, you know, again, I didn't grade everybody, so if you told me he went at the end of the 2nd, I wouldn't mind. If you told me the 1st, I'd think you're crazy, though, right? I have Hyatt here, 75.40. Solid player, but not necessarily the top of the top. Next up, Ivan Pace Jr., someone that I didn't know a ton about, but one of the more unique players in this draft class, just as far as, in particular, his ability as a blitzer. And usually I'm not somebody who looks at blitzing as a super valuable thing for a linebacker to, you know, to do, but I think the ways that he got there were impressive, right? It wasn't just the fact that, oh, he can shoot a wide open gap. It's, oh, he can get off a block. He can beat you with his quickness at times. He can, you know, he was a really efficient finisher and tackler. He had a solid motor. On the flip side, maybe better suited for a 3-4 where you can pair him with a coverage almost specialist at that other inside position. Or even might just put him at Sam, because I did think his coverage skills were notably behind the rest of the pack there out of Cincinnati. But a solid player nonetheless, and someone that, again, I think if you can get towards the, you know, towards the hundreds, you know, nearing the hundreds, I should say, rather, in that 3rd round range, I think Ivan Pace Jr. Could be a very solid option there. And yet again, what I'll say is a rather weak linebacker class. Next up, Anthony Johnson Jr. Speaking of a weak class, we already talked about it with safety at the top, but I do think he's a bit of an intriguing option as you start to progress in the days. Cornerback turned safety. I still think he's trying to adapt to the position, but a solid athlete and someone who is comfortable in coverage at the very least, and not willing to trigger either and fill uphill. I liked a lot of what I saw. I think maybe some of the play recognition, for example, and reading things from as far back as he is, and the eye discipline. I think some of that maybe needs to be cleaned up, but a good player here who I wouldn't be shocked if is able to make a positive impact on your team. Maybe not right away, but once you're able to work on some of those sort of transitional things, I think you might have a very solid player here in Johnson Jr. Man, next up is an interesting one, Nick Herbig. I created a whole new grading scale for him. I realized that the distinction that is usually given to defensive ends versus outside linebackers, I created a bit of a new position for him just based on his role at Wisconsin, because I almost think he has to play something like it at the next level. He was a guy who spent at least a fifth of the game, it felt like, lined up as a slot corner, but then would also be an impactful pass rusher, right? Just an interesting guy. Is he a full-time edge rusher? Perhaps not, but you also might be able to use some of that experience in some interesting zone blitz looks. He's someone that is certainly undersized, though, and while he did add weight prior to the combine, might need to still add some more, although you don't want to necessarily impact the quickness either. So he's an interesting player that I'm a little bit skeptical as far as how his game's going to translate, but I think if you craft a role specifically for him, kind of like I had to craft a grading rubric specifically for him, one that's maybe a little bit more linebacker than it is edge rusher, I think you very could well have a solid player here in Herbig at a 74.91. Next up, Byron Young, the defensive tackle out of Alabama. Now, he's not the flashiest player in the world, but he's not he's not afraid to make some nice plays either. I felt like he's someone who could have a solid impact both as a pass rusher as well as a run defender, and has a good mix of explosiveness as far as the burst is concerned, as far as the get off is concerned, as well as maybe some of the technical aspects of the game, right? Of course, did play at Alabama. You would assume, and I think you do see in his game some well-coached play, but at the same time, I don't know necessarily how high the ceiling is with Byron there. Just a solid player that if you're looking to add some rotational, another solid rotational piece to your D-line room, I think he can be the guy. A good motor, he's there in both phases. Maybe not going to pop in either or make a ton of plays in either, but can make an adequate amount in both. I like Byron quite a bit here at a 74.88. Christopher Smith. Oh, man. Almost similar to Brenton Cox in a way. There were flashes of first-round tape. You put on that first game against Oregon, and, oh, brother, you could have told me he was safety one, and I would have believed you. That said, you continue to get deeper and deeper into his games, and I think maybe some more issues continue to emerge. Just getting turned around in coverage and not always comfortable, to say the least, in space. I have some questions about Christopher Smith. That said, a willing and able tackler against the run. I thought was a better athlete on film than he showed off at the combine, for example. But a really interesting player, someone who, I don't want to use that boomer bust tag, but I wouldn't be shocked if we look back at this draft 5 years from now and say he should have been a first rounder, or we look back at this draft and say he probably should have been a fifth, right? He's one of those types of guys. I think for me, you kind of balance that out, and how he grades out on my safety grading rubric comes out to a solid third round grade, and someone that I wouldn't be opposed to having on my team, but I think you have to have a certain build and role for him to do so, if that makes any sense at all. Next up, speaking of a specific role, Kobe Turner. Talk about a 3 technique at the next level. Someone you likely haven't heard of, because I hadn't really either. But that said, he's a smaller guy and a little bit of an older prospect, but he is a very hard worker, and that can't be overlooked. Someone whose hands never die. He's always fighting. The motor's always churning. And he's just an active player. I actually thought for his size, he played against double teams pretty well and showed off an ability to anchor that surpassed maybe what I would have expected, but someone that I think is going to go much later than this, but I think you could get some interesting value on. I would be willing and comfortable taking him solidly into that third round yet again. And essentially the midway point, Jaden Reed, a very interesting prospect out of MSU. He's, on the smaller side, but plays bigger than his height. There's almost some flashes of Deontay Johnson in Reed, where, he's got this size that would make you think he's more of a slot and more of a inside guy that's going to win with his quickness and route running. But then you put on the tape and he's, climbing the ladder and beating guys over the top, right? Just mossing guys at times and making these spectacular contested catches. So a very interesting player, someone that I'll be curious to see what role he garners at the next level, but someone that I would feel very good about getting in the third round there if I needed, I don't want to say a wide receiver 2 right away, but I think someone who could certainly develop into one sooner rather than later. Very solid player here to add to a solid wide receiver room. Next up, another player that I'm a little bit lower on than the national consensus. Seems like Will McDonald might be more likely to go in round 1 than round 3, but I have him graded where I have him graded, right? An older prospect yet again. Someone who will wow you with the quickness and the bend and the motor. And if you take that trio and just want a speed rusher, you can have it, right? Because I think there's some other areas of the game that maybe I value more than others. Most notably, his ability to set the edge, his ability to anchor, his ability to deconstruct blocks for someone who's an older guy and someone you would expect to have sort of that nuanced hand usage by now. It's just not there. I didn't see it. I didn't love his block recognition. I don't want to rag on the guy, but I feel like I have to explain myself as to why I do have him in the third rather than, say, the late first, early second. But for me, he's a bit of a one-trick pony, right? And I think that even still to this point, through that second round, you need to be looking for guys that are either, are going to pop more at that one trick than Will might, or are going to be more balanced all around, as you've seen some of the previous pass rushers and edge defenders on my list. So solid player, someone that I wouldn't mind getting in the third round, but ultimately someone that I don't think I can say with 100% certainty I have no questions about, because there most certainly are, including what the heck is he going to do on third and short, right? Next up, speaking of questions, I had to bust out the red flag for Michael Wilson. Was solid when he was out there for Stanford, but a litany of injuries never really let him see the field. Right, he's a guy who's at Stanford for 5 years and hasn't played more than 6 games since his true sophomore season. The last 3 years combined has only played 14 games. So in that regard, a tough guy to evaluate. You see the red flag. I like him. I think he's a solid talent, but I just question where you can take a guy who's already a little bit older, but at the same time, also not very experienced either. He's a solid route runner, good as far as, contested catches and his tracking and body control are concerned, as well as even at times getting off the line of scrimmage. But I just have some questions about the speed and quickness, the hands, the consistency, things of that nature. Not going to overwhelm you with his yak ability, but, can overwhelm you if you're a corner as far as his blocking is concerned. Good player, good size, but the question is going to be, can he remain on the field? I hope for his sake he can. But yeah, I think he's someone that I have some questions about here, even in the third round of the NFL draft. Next up, Siaki Ika. You've probably been waiting for me to call his name, and I don't hate him by any means. I just think he's a little bit more limited than it seems most do. Even for a nose tackle, or I should say for a nose tackle, he didn't wow me with his ability to anchor. It felt like he almost, plays more like a one technique in a nose tackle body. And in that regard, just yielded some interesting results. not very fluid as far as an ability to finish and tackle. There were plays where he could have put his whole hand square in the man's sternum, but he just didn't get there because it didn't feel like he was fluid enough to get his hips turned and make a play, right? So many plays that they were just running right by him or juking right around him that were really disappointing for me, and was a guy that if he was able to build on his 2021 campaign and what he showed on tape there, might have had a chance to be a first rounder at one point. But for me, after a little bit of a more questionable 2022, has slipped to the third as far as my grades are concerned. Not someone that I'm opposed to seeing off the board in the late second, but at that point just wouldn't be on my team if I was drafting. But if you need a big guy in the middle of your defense, Ika can fill it. I just question what he's necessarily going to bring as far as either as a run defender or pass rusher is concerned. Next up, Colby Wooden. A higher motor guy, one of the better technicians in this class, but some questions about where he's going to play. Auburn lined him up pretty much everywhere, whether it was inside as a 3 technique, a 4-eye, to even outside at times as a stand-up edge rusher. Almost profiles more so there as far as the height, weight, speed combination is concerned. But the majority of his reps did come with his hand in the dirt, lined up against tackles and guards. So a bit of a tough guy to project. I do like him, though. There is going to be some stuff to clean up as far as the leverage is concerned and things of that nature, but active with his hands and is going to be a tough out no matter who he's going up against at the next level. I like Wooden and will be interested to see where he plays there at a 72.80. Next up, Sidney Brown. The first of the Brown twins that I watched here for Illinois. And he's an interesting one. He can play, he can do and play a little bit of everything, but at the same time, I question just to what level. There has to be some value given to that versatility, but if the play is always almost just all right, I don't know how high he can go. He's someone I've seen in the second round discussion. I don't quite agree with that, but I think whether you want him to be a deep safety and in the box, strong safety, at times a linebacker on some sub packages, he can make an impact in a variety of ways. I just always question how impactful that will essentially be, as I liked him, but almost surprised myself by how much I like Jartavis more. So Sidney's a solid player, but just didn't quite cut it, I think, for what a lot of teams are looking for out of their safeties. In my opinion, I have him at a 72.7 here, solidly in the third round. Next up, Zach Evans. A guy who has all the traits but never put it together. Never once put it together. You'd see flashes on film, but if he doesn't fix, if he doesn't fix the drops, if he doesn't clean up the pass protection, I don't really know what role he'll have, but at the same time, the traits otherwise are really good. Impressive balance, good speed, some solid acceleration and vision at times, right? I like Evans. I like the idea of Evans, but I don't love what we saw for Ole Miss here in 2022, to the point that he even really lost the starting job midway through the season, after an injury-riddled campaign. So in that regard, solid player, someone I wouldn't mind here in the sort of later third round, but I think if you go much higher than that, you might have more questions than answers, right? Because that's currently where I'm at with Evans. Next up, though, a running back that I thought, unlike Evans, did come to play every game, right? Someone who did lead a team and was a workhorse back. When I said the Brown twins, I don't know if you expected them to be so neck and neck with each other. I have Chase higher than most here at a 72.32. Very fun player to watch. Can do a little bit of everything. Does need to clean up some areas, and maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling in the world, but if you're looking to add to your running back room, someone who can win with agility, win with speed and burst, win with power and balance, Chase Brown's your guy. Similar to some of those top runners as far as the balance is concerned, but maybe instead of being an A minus B plus in every category, we're talking more about someone who is, say, a B minus C plus, right? Not that that's a bad thing. I think that's just who Chase Brown is, a very solid runner and someone I think has been overrated. I should say underrated rather through this draft process. I like him more than most people do. Trust me. That's my bad. Next up, Byron Young, and no, it's not a typo. There are two of them, this time from Tennessee, and man, is he a good story. He's someone who had to fight to even get back to this point and even be playing. And once he got there, he did not disappoint. An older prospect, sure, but you saw it at the combine as far as the explosiveness and quickness is concerned. He has one of the best first steps in the draft, and despite the age, I think could be a very solid utility speed rusher here into the later rounds. I like him a lot. I'd feel comfortable taking him in the third. And I think really the gap between him and Will McDonald is not nearly as much as people are making it out to be. I really like Byron out of Tennessee. Solid player to watch, and I'll be interested to see where he goes. Next up, speaking of solid players, Tyjae Spears, someone who's climbed a little bit here later in the process. Just pretty impressive all around. They'd line him up at receiver. He'd make plays out of the backfield. He could surprise you with his vision at times, right? A little bit of an unconventional runner here and there, but had some very solid bursts, some impressive balance, and nice agility that rounded him up into a nice little package there that I think will be a very solid back at the next level. Again, maybe not a lead guy, especially off the bat, but I think can play as a complement to a more powerful rusher at a very high level, not only in 2023, but for years to come. I like Tyjae Spears, the running back out of Tulane, quite a bit. Next up, Jair Brown, the safety out of Penn State. One of the more interesting prospects because he makes some splash plays both in coverage and against the run. Right? He's someone that I think does have some pretty solid instincts, I would say. Impressed in that regard. At least, in terms of the reactionary quickness and really impressed with the ball skills. But I do have some questions about his range at times, both as a tackler, but even more so, I would say, as a coverage guy. But that said, if you just, if you give him an assignment and give him maybe a little bit of a smaller zone, I do think he's someone who can make plays for you. Just maybe not the most explosive athlete with the greatest speed or the quickest feet, for example. I have Jair Brown graded here as a later third round grade at a 71.93. Next up, a red flag, but a fun player nonetheless, Deuce Vaughn. Not a red flag for anything he's done wrong off the field, but man, his size is a concern. And I wish it wasn't because he was so fun. And he was so tough at Kansas State too. It's tough to look at a guy who's never gotten hurt and was the Iron Man of that Kansas State offense, essentially never coming off the field, and say, I'm worried about how he'll be able to sustain an NFL workload. It's just tough to rationalize in that regard, and I feel bad to have to do it, but I like Deuce a lot. He can make an impact as a receiver, sneaky tough as far as the balance is concerned, and he can run away from you if you don't have a good angle. Just a very fun, electric player to watch. Is always a threat to take the ball to the opposite end zone, although at the same time, that speed gap is going to decrease a little bit at the next level to the point that maybe some of that big playability will diminish a little bit. But I think in a limited capacity and in a role specific to his skill set, I think could still be a very impactful player. I have Deuce Vaughn there at the end of my third round, albeit with a red flag. Don't know where he's going to go, but I think if you can get him in the late fourth or fifth round, perhaps you could be getting one of the steals of the draft. I like Deuce quite a bit. Next up, I had to give another red flag here for some off-the-field issues with Mazi Smith. Just another guy who has the physical tools, but I didn't think really put them together in nearly the way that you would have liked to have seen on film. Never really made an impact as far as, his pass rush ability was concerned. And, despite being relatively stout at the point of attack, I even thought could be a little bit disappointing there at times. So, it's a tough guy for me to project. I think he does have the physical traits, though, and it seems as though some teams might be interested in gambling on that as early as the first round. I just don't quite see it. For example, I gave him a 13.5 out of 20 on pass rush ability, a 5 out of 10 on motor, a 1.5 out of 5 on block recognition, right? Like, there are some rather low grades here. But at the same time, again, like I said, violent hands, high in terms of his block shedding, and solid as far as his anchor, ability to anchor and strength at the point of attack, just not quite to the extent of the other noses that we've already touched on, whether it was Ika, whether it was Coburn, or guys of that nature. I like Mazi, but I think and am afraid that he's going to be a little bit overdrafted here come Thursday and or Friday. I would feel most comfortable with him at the very least towards the end of the third, and depending on what you want to do with the off the field stuff, could be even later than that. Just a tough player for me to grade, in my opinion, and someone that I'm most certainly lower on than the national media. Otherwise, a player I might be a little bit higher on, Roshan, was the backup to Bijan, and what more could you ask out of a guy in that backup role? He did it all for the Longhorns as far as his pass blocking was concerned, with the highest graded pass blocker I've had over 3 years of using this grade scale. Really impressed in that regard. Was a hard runner, impressive balance, good power, but then traits start to trail off, right? Can catch the ball out of the backfield to an extent, but not going to wow you with his speed or agility and elusiveness and things of that nature. I do like him, though, and think that if he was on an offense as a lead back in college, I think he could have posted certainly over 1,000 yards just based on what he was doing in a limited sample size there at Texas. I like him, and I would really like him if you were able to get him, deeper and deeper into day 3, right? Someone I have as an early 4th round grade on, but a fun player nonetheless. Next up, we have Ademoye Adebaware, who is an interesting player and someone I expect to go either in round 1 or most likely round 2, just based on the combine performance and athletic traits that he has. But for me, he's a guy that I struggled to place as far as whether he should be a D tackle or a D end. I don't know if either is a natural fit. Not that he's bad by any means, but I just had some questions, right? And it felt like no matter which position I tried to project him at, things weren't necessarily as favorable on my end as they are the national media's. I think he's a solid player, though. I just think maybe needs to be a little bit more nuanced as far as his technique is concerned, whether he is inside or outside. But yeah, hey, if you can put all that together with the speed, then I think you might just very well have a solid player here. I just don't know if I'd be willing to bet on that as early as, say, pick 30, pick 40, etc., etc. For me, I have him at the top of the 4th round here. Next up here at a 70.98, we have Jacqueline Roy, who is an interesting guy because kind of as I'm going through these players and highlighting their positives and negatives, Jacqueline's a guy who doesn't do anything, at a overwhelmingly offensive level, but at the same time doesn't do anything crazy elite either. For example, if I just run through his grades, you could hear the numbers: 16 out of 20, 14 out of 20, 11 out of 15, 6 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 275 out of 5, 25 out of 5, 275 out of 5, and then 425 on size and 3 on athleticism, right? But in that regard, I think even though we are into here my 4th round grades, I think you can still get solid contributors. And I think a guy like Jacqueline Roy, even though I don't think he's necessarily going to be, necessarily a starter off the bat or anything like that, I think he's a guy that you could rotate in, get some solid reps out of, and hopefully has a brighter future as he continues to potentially make some of those 6s and 7s out of 10s into 8s and 9s, right? Would I bank on that? No, though, and that's why I have him here in the 4th round grades. Next up, we have Cedric Tillman, who is another interesting one. He's a guy that I was really impressed with, over the course of the film that I watched of Tillman. That said, not a lot of film on Tillman, and that's really why that red flag came down here. He's a guy that has only played more than 6 games once throughout his entire career at Tennessee in a season, right? So even though, he was really good as far as his hands are concerned, the contested catches were concerned, solid as a route runner, there were some questions elsewhere for me, most notably as far as the speed was concerned and his ability to get off the line yet again. I feel like that's somewhat of a commonality for this class, but really the number one concern with him is health. And in that regard, I have him graded as a 4th round talent, but might be a guy that you don't feel comfortable with taking until, another round or 2 goes by, just because of the inability to stay on the field. Next up, Andre Carter, the big man out of Army, one of the most NFL body type guys of the draft, but for me, another player that I'm just a little bit lower on than the consensus seems to be. I didn't think he was necessarily, even though he's got a big body, I didn't think he was necessarily the most athletic guy, and it almost seemed like he was maybe stiffer than anything else, right? When it came to bending the edge, when it came to hitting some pass rush moves and finishing and tackling, it just felt like things were a little bit more stilted maybe than I would like. So in that regard, solid player, very high ceiling, I'll say it, but if I'm not mistaken, he only did like 11 reps on bench at the combine. I can see that in the way he plays as far as an ability to anchor and play against the run. Just some questions in my opinion. Not that he's a bad player by any means. He was a little bit misused at Army. They were dropping him in coverage, which I don't think I would ever do personally, but he was trying his best, right? In that regard, solid guy, but not someone that I think I'd be comfortable taking much higher than, say, the late 3rd or, as you see here, early 4th round. Next up, Zach Harrison. A little bit of a different guy than Carter, but their grades come out pretty similarly, right? This is sort of that next tier of pass rushers, in my opinion. Harrison can kind of do a little bit of everything. I thought he was maybe most impressive as a athlete to an extent, right? He had good quick burst and could at times show you flashes as far as an ability to set the edge and some flexibility and bend is concerned, but needed to do a better job getting off blocks and getting around guys as a pass rusher as well as run defender, in my opinion, but had a decently high motor, and I did like his block recognition. That was one grade of his that I did give a noteworthy number to. So overall, solid player. Again, I do think you could give him some, a pretty decent snap share off the bat here. I think he's a solid guy. And again, just like Carter, someone who, if he went really anything past 80, I think would be fine, just given kind of the depth of this class. But overall, I do have a upper 4th round grade on here today. So next up, we have Duvon Achane. I was talking about Jameer being electricity personified. Duvon is just lightning, right? He is just an absolute burner. An All-American. And when I say that, your ears are probably perking up like, oh, wow, really? In track. And in that regard, I do question a little bit some of the more, football traits, right? Like, oh, how's the vision? I don't know, right? I wasn't a big fan. Can you really run him between the tackles? I don't know, right? But hey, if you're just looking for someone in an outside zone heavy scheme to try and get the edge and turn up field, I do think Duvon Achane is your guy, as well as someone who can make some very solid receiving plays out of the backfield. Good player, but someone I do have maybe graded a little bit lower than the consensus seems to as well. Next up, staying at the running back position, Sean Tucker. I think he's a pretty balanced guy, or someone that, a year ago, people seem to have thought was going to go higher and be more highly regarded. I think he's just fine where he's at. I like him. He can do a little bit of everything. He has, good size. He's solidly agile for his size, but at the same time can sustain
his balance through contact as well. I like Sean Tucker quite a bit. They used him as a receiver a good chunk as well, at least out of the backfield, and I thought he did a sufficient job there. I like Sean Tucker here, again, as a guy late 3, early 4 that you could just get some very solid carries out of. That said, now that we are going to be under 70 as far as my grades are concerned, as well as over 70, ironically enough, as far as the big board is concerned, we are going to try and speed it up a little bit here just to get through things. No slight on any of these guys, but I hope you guys understand. And if you have any questions about any of them, just drop them in the comment section down below. Next up, we do have Rashee Rice, who was the contested catch king. He was incredibly physical and a good blocker, but I do have some questions about his hands and route running and things of that nature. Dante Stills, a little bit of a surprise to me. Explosive guy who just never seemed to stay blocked, but I question maybe some of the technique and how he does it and how that's going to translate to the next level. But a good guy who has some interesting maybe defensive tackle, defensive end versatility, as he played quite a bit of both at West Virginia. Fun player, though, in the 4th round. Kendre's got a big body, and he's young. He's another guy kind of like Felix Anudike-Uzomah, where he's a young guy, maybe a green flag guy, right? Someone who, though I only have him graded as a 4th rounder now, he's someone that, hey, you could technically sit him and play him behind as a secondary option behind a solid starter for 2 to 3 years even, and then by that time he's still only 23, 24, and then he's just taking over and hitting stride at that point in time. So in that regard, he's another one of these guys where I think the upside is probably higher than the grade suggests, but right away I'm not that high on Kendre right away, if that makes sense, right? I've seen some people say, 2nd round even, or particularly 3rd round. I would probably feel more comfortable in the 4th, but I do think there is some upside there if you do want to play the long game, perhaps, and try and bet on him cleaning up some of the weaker areas of his game. Next up, see, now that I said speed it up, I can't talk all of a sudden. Zach Pickens out of South Carolina. Interesting player. Has the size intangibles and whatnot that you're looking for, and was a solid athlete. Just a little bit inconsistent, in my opinion, and didn't really put it all together as far as pass rushing was concerned, outside of a few stretches every now and then, right? It was like, hey, when he could pin his ears back and he knew it was guaranteed to be a pass, it felt like he could be pretty impactful, but those situations are pretty rare and few and far between, unless you're leading by a lot, or it's 2-minute drill. And that was really where I thought he made the most impact, but otherwise just felt like game to game a little bit too inconsistent for my liking. I have Pickens here to 69.42. Next up, Drew Sanders, another guy that I know a lot of people really like. He's a DN converted to linebacker, and I just still think that he is getting acquainted. I don't hate him by any means. One of the better block shedders of anybody in the class, although I do think at times he can try and avoid contact a little bit too much, and I question some of the quickness and change of directions, things of that nature. But then really for me, where he falls short of the other guys I have above him are in terms of the range of pursuit and coverage skills, where I just don't really see it yet. To me, more of a developmental guy than, say, the way people are talking about him, right? People seem to be on him in the 2nd round, and I agree. He has 2nd round, he has 1st round size even, but I think we're a little bit too far out to be going that high on him now. Next up, Israel Abanikanda, in the same light as Kendre Miller. If I'm not mistaken, he doesn't turn 21 years old until November. So again, a guy where you have a ton of time with, another one of those what I would dub green flag guys, someone who's been quite underrated through the process, but I think he's a really solid all-around runner, can do a little bit of everything. Probably a better pass catcher than he is pass blocker, I would say. But yeah, another interesting player that, again, is sort of in that similar light as, say, a Kendre, right? Where he might not be able to make a huge impact right away, or maybe you don't even want him to, but I think really where he'll shine is a couple years down the line, assuming he's able to find a role. I did just kind of thinking about what I just said. I did say better pass catcher than pass blocker. Flip that, 100%. Abanikanda barely caught any balls at Pittsburgh and was a solid pass blocker. That's what I meant to say, but I think you guys get where I'm coming from. Like I said, I can't really talk now that we're rapid firing through these. Tank Bigsby, the best name in college football, perhaps. Didn't always live up to it, though, I didn't think. I felt played smaller than his size, and even though I like him to get, some solid carries for your team, I don't necessarily love him, and I don't see the upside, right? Another one of these more balanced backs, I think, that can do a little bit of everything, but maybe nothing at an incredibly high level. I have him here at 77. Next up, we have Bryce Ford Wheaton, the wide receiver out of West Virginia, who is a really intriguing guy. And the main reason for that is because I don't think he has even decided whether he wants to be the next DK Metcalf or Quintez Cephas, right? He's someone who was used in an incredibly unique fashion at West Virginia. It felt like almost exclusively go routes, although obviously there were some others mixed in there too, but they were just hucking it to him deep. And there were games where he'd come up with 4 of them, and then there were other games where it felt like not even close on any, right? And I think in some of those games you'd have obviously some consistency issues overall, but I think the hands would be questionable, the ability to get off the line was questionable, the route running is questionable, right? But then other games he would look like one of the top receivers in the draft. So an interestingly polarizing guy, and I think maybe one of the more boomer bust prospects, but someone who I'd be willing to take in the 4th round yet again. Next up, Ventrell Miller. Smaller guy, active guy, fun guy to watch. Not gonna be the best at getting off blocks ever, but I think can be at the very least a really impactful special teamer. But I actually think he should be able to see the field as far as, especially in some nickel and dime packages off the bat, but potentially as he continues to hone some of his skills and whatnot, potentially see play as a will linebacker at the next level. He was a rather impressive guy for me that I like here in the 4th round. I just think there are some weaknesses kind of holding him back from going much higher. Next up, this one hurts, man. Mohamed Ibrahim. If he would have came out and declared 2 years ago, he very well might have been a 1st round pick. Might have been the number 1 running back off the board. But after tearing his Achilles tendon, just tough, right? Tough with a running back. He's an older guy now. Teams in the NFL are moving on from running backs that are already the age of Ibrahim, right? We're talking about someone who's going to be 25 and the whole rookie, he's just tough. He's really tough. And that's why the red flag's there. I'm not 100% certain that he gets drafted, but if he doesn't, I think he should be a priority free agent because I do really like his skills. And even after coming back from the torn Achilles, he kept on putting 100-yard games up on the stat sheet, right? So he was impressive after he came back and productive after he came back, but a lot of wear and tear on the legs that have already kind of failed him once in one regard. And just a tough prospect because I don't quite think things looked as good in 2022 as they looked previously, right? Like, even though the stats are fine and good and all, and pretty similar actually to what he was posting, pre-injury, there's just some questions about the burst and things of that nature, but solid vision and a good player and someone I really do hope is able to latch onto a team that's ready to compete because I think he's someone compared to a lot of these rookies that I'm saying, maybe give him a couple years to develop. No, I think Mohamed Ibrahim's best year will be potentially 2023 or 2024, right? There's almost that kind of Jay Ajayi factor to it, right? Where there were talks, prior to the draft about his knees being bone on bone, and what do you do with it? Well, hey, guess what? He went to Miami, had some electric run there, and then bounced around a little bit prior to exiting the league. And I think there might be a little bit of that with Ibrahim where he's able to catch on right away, especially if he goes to a contending team, for example, or just a team even with an injured starter, and he can step in and get carries. I think he'll do the job early, but I do have questions on the long term as far as just what he offers your team. Really good talent, though, and I like him quite a bit here in the 4th round. If it weren't for the injury, that would be great value. We'll be curious to see where he goes otherwise. Rashad Torrance, interesting player. I feel like he's someone who I don't fully know if he's a free safety or a strong, and I don't mean that in a way that's necessarily bad. Like, in that regard, he's kind of balanced in both. I think he's probably better in coverage than run support, but it's pretty close. Not the quickest or most explosive dude, and needs to improve some reactionary quickness, but a solid player if you're looking for a safety, in my opinion, on day 3 here. Next up, Dylan Horton. Another guy, actually someone who I'm a little bit higher on probably than the majority of people. I thought he was a hard worker for TCU. He was constantly in the backfield of opposing teams all the way through to the national championship, right? Was constantly making his mark on games. That said, how are the traits going to translate to the next level? I'm not really sure, right? Not necessarily the most explosive guy, not necessarily the most refined tool belt, or bendy guy, but at the same time, a really hard worker, someone who plays with good leverage, is going to do everything he can not to get driven off the ball, and has some really good reps against the run. So I like Horton. He seems like a guy who you might be able to get a round or two later than the 4th, and I think in that regard, he would be a pretty solid value. Next up, Dwayne McBride. Talk about productive. You have to talk about McBride. Towards the top of the FBS in yards this past season. I believe had he played the bowl game, he likely would have led them in yards. He was leading almost throughout the entirety of the season. Was a very productive college player. I just have questions about how that's going to translate, particularly in terms of the burst. Not much as far as his receiving usage either, so a little bit limited in that regard. But I thought some solid vision, right? You have to have solid vision if you're going to be a 16, 17, 1,800-yard guy. But I just have questions about how that's going to translate against, stiffer competition and better athletes at the next level. I like him, 67.24, but again, I think he's a guy where maybe the production doesn't tell the whole picture when you look, compared to some of the traits that you actually see and how that's going to translate. Next up, Kayshon Boutte. What the heck am I supposed to say about this guy? We've all heard the rumors of of how things transpired there at LSU. He could arguably be a red flag candidate in that regard, which is disappointing considering, a year ago today he was considered, it was him and Jackson Smith and Jigba neck and neck, it seemed, at the top of boards, who would be the wide receiver 1, and then LSU, new regime in town, didn't really work out, right? Didn't quite work out. And I think when you put on the film, struggles with drops here and there, not necessarily the most explosive guy. He's a quicker than fast guy, in my opinion. Not necessarily going to climb the ladder and have a ton of contested catches, and nor is he the most physical, high motor, hard-working blocker either. So you just start questioning what's his role going to be. I like him a bit, but he's someone I'm a little bit lower on, I think, now than I would have expected even a year ago today. Dorian Williams, good player, athletic player. He's willing to be physical. I think I wish he was willing to be even more physical, right? I think he has the athletic traits and, really everything he needs to do the job. And, he did it to a pretty high level at Tulane as far as the range and pursuit and things of that nature were concerned. But solid in coverage. I just think needs to clean up a little bit as a block shedder, as someone in terms of his finishing and tackling and things of that nature. But another solid player, as I do think this linebacker class tends to be a little bit more talented here on the back end than it is at the top, for example. I think Dorian's a solid guy, though, and if you're looking to add to your room, he might be somewhat of a developmental piece, right? Next up, Marvin Mims, leading receiver at Oklahoma. Another guy that just didn't really wow me. Solid here and there, I thought, in particular. Just in my opinion, I thought the speed and quickness jumped off the tape. The hands were solid and the yak ability's there, but past that, I did have some questions. So for me, he fell to the highest grade in the 5th round. Again, not a player that I hate, but just a player that I do have some questions about otherwise, and I wasn't really impressed as far as his consistency and whatnot was concerned at Oklahoma. Carl Brooks, he was consistently in the backfield at Bowling Green, but part of that felt like it was the level of competition he was playing. That said, a big guy, a little bit of questions as far as just where he's going to play. He was primarily an edge rusher, but as someone over 300 pounds, he looked out of place, even though he was certainly doing the job. So he's someone who I think is going to go from more of a stand-up outside linebacker role to potentially a hand-in-the-dirt 3-tech or potentially 4-tech. It's going to be an interesting transition. That said, he does have really violent hands, and I think that could help ease the transition. I just have some questions about maybe his motor and things of that nature, which I've seen other people talk highly about, but personally in the games I watched, I didn't quite see it. Kenny McIntosh. Next up, one of the better receiving backs in the draft. Someone who I thought was a much better athlete on tape than he showed at the combine, as well as the pro day. 4.70 40 at the pro day is just brutal, and is one of the reasons that he's a little bit lower here than I might have expected. I think he needs to improve the vision and just kind of put everything together, right? You'll have some solid stretches of McIntosh. He can put together good drives, but then other times, again, as we've kind of mentioned with a lot of these guys, there's sort of a consistency factor with them. It's not that I hate any of these sort of late 4th, early 5th round players. It's just that I think there's either some athletic limitations or some consistency issues, and McIntosh is no exception. Next up, never really learned how to say the name, but we're going to say Darrell Nachimi out of Maryland, number 30. An interesting guy because obviously Maryland had the 2 corners, right? Deonte Banks, Jacorian Bennett, neither guy that I watched, unfortunately, and you do have to wonder how much of their front 7 play needs to be sort of attributed to having those guys on the back end. I liked Nachimi to an extent. I thought he was a pretty hard worker. I thought he showed off some decent flexibility and bend, as well as explosiveness and quickness, no question. As well, obviously just being an all-around good athlete. But I do have some questions about just how refined is he, particularly in terms of the hand usage and block deconstruction. Solid player, but again, more of a rotational guy in my opinion. Next up, D. Winters, another consistent contributor on that TCU defense, and another guy who had some flashes, had some impressive ball skills and interceptions from time to time. I think he can play in coverage to an extent, but otherwise, decent as far as range and pursuit, decent as far as block shedding. To me, where he left the most to be desired was the IQ and awareness, as well as quickness and change of direction. Too many missed tackles and things of that nature for D, too many late reads, but when it comes to what he did well, I did like him to an extent there, and think he could be a solid not only potential special teamer, but someone who, again, you might be able to find a little bit of a secondary role for at first, as far as, hey, here, take a drive here and there, and then hopefully he can slowly and surely build upon some of those weaker areas. Next up, Ali Gay, defensive end out of LSU. He was clearly the second best guy across from BJ Ojulari, but I didn't hate anything he did. He was a pretty hard-nosed player, a tough guy, had a decent motor, and I liked his ability to set the edge opposite of Ojulari. BJ's not the best at playing the run, and I felt in that regard, Gay might have even been better than him. And I thought he was better than him, right? I thought teams were running at BJ more than they were Ali. And in that regard, solid, but I just think needs to improve some of his block recognition, finishing and tackling, and particularly the hand usage. They're just a little bit too raw of a guy for me to put much higher than this. Speaking of raw, we have a raw talent here in Jervon Dexter Sr., someone who is probably the biggest difference from me to the national media. During the combine, they were talking about how great of a performance he had, and I don't don't disagree with that, but there was talks about him going in round 1. I have him here at the end of my round 5 grades. I'm not trying to disrespect him, but probably the slowest get off of any talented player I've ever seen, and it's really, really, really frustrating. In that regard, he's a guy that I hope to be able to have time to make an individual video for, just because I think you'll see it over the course of the game. Like, yes, there's splashes and positive plays, but man, you just gotta move, you know? You just gotta go. It's just tough. And on a Florida defense that I thought was decently talented, I thought, you saw him next to some potential NFL guys, and it just didn't seem like he was standing out almost ever, right? Good plays here and there, but the bad plays and plays where it didn't even feel like he was moving. Like they say, the tortoise and the hare, but hey, man, we're in the hares league. We are in the quick twitch league, and it just felt like Javon was modeling his game a little bit more after the tortoise. Yeah, and once he got going, he was fine as far as the explosiveness, but man, that burst was just brutal. And I hate doing it to him, but I have him here towards the bottom of my 5th round grades. Next up, a little bit lower than that, I have Aubrey Miller Jr., the linebacker out of Jackson State. Interesting player, and again, there's obviously going to be the competition concerns, but I thought, had some really solid coverage reps and is a candidate to see the field there, as well as on special teams and whatnot. Pretty early on, I liked him in that regard. I thought he was all right in terms of shedding blocks, but some limitations as far as maybe his quickness and change of direction, as well as finishing and tackling was concerned, and I'm a little bit worried about that. If you can't finish and tackle at Jackson State, how's it going to transit to the NFL? There are some concerns there, but overall, another player that I like a decent bit. Chris Rodriguez, someone who, on the flip side of Aubrey, did a good job forcing missed tackles, but again, similar to Dwayne McBride, to an extent, just not, I don't think he's quite the NFL athlete as far as the burst and long speed are concerned. Maybe can find a role as a short yardage, back in spurts, because he did have really impressive balance and power, two of the highest graded traits, of anybody that I gave out. But, to run through somebody past the line of scrimmage, you have to get there first. And I thought that's maybe where Chris falls short, in my opinion. Not saying he can't make a team, but I do have some questions about how he's going to contribute. And I think, frankly, I have him graded here as a late 5. I do think he's a guy you might be able to get even later than that. Speaking of a guy that you won't be able to get this late, but I just have some questions about, we have J.L. Skinner, the safety out of Boise State. I didn't even give him the red flag. He did just sustain an injury during the pre-draft process, so it's a little bit unclear as far as what his availability is going to be, but man, he played so flat-footed for me and struggled from what I was seeing to make reads at least quickly. Not saying the reads were bad necessarily, but I gave him a 4 out of 10 as far as reactionary quickness and a 9 out of 15 as far as his range was concerned. It just felt like sometimes you had to, unhitch the wagon, right? I don't know what he offers as far as coverage is concerned, particularly man coverage. Maybe you could man him up against some really, large physical tight ends, and maybe he'll be able to play against them. But against slot receivers and backs out of the backfield, I don't think that's going to work out. It didn't from what I saw, frankly, and that's obviously at Boise State. So an interesting player, feels like someone who's maybe built for a prior generation or two when maybe there's more of a premium on hard-hitting strong safeties. But yeah, an interesting player, just not somebody that I would expect to end up with on my team, right? Not saying he's bad, but if I was a GM, I'd be waiting around to the 6th round to potentially take a guy like him, and at that point, you just know he won't be there. Next up, at the top of my 7th round grades, we have Jeremy Banks, the linebacker out of Tennessee, who again, was a decently productive player, and I thought flashed some solid range and pursuit. To me, just wasn't quite refined enough as far as his coverage skills and his efficiency as far as his reads and whatnot were concerned. Also, despite being a solid athlete, I thought the quickness and change of direction skills were a little bit shaky at times. So again, he's someone that I would look for later in day 3, but is still someone that I do think could make a team and make an impact on special teams at the very least. Speaking of, next up we have Cameron Peoples, who was an interesting running back out of App State. Another powerful guy, similar to Chris Rodriguez in that regard. Showed off some really good balance and certainly has NFL size. Yet again, I just question the burst and the long speed for him as well, to the point that, I'm not sold on the fact that he's going to make a roster right away as far as being drafted is concerned, but I do think, again, at the very least, he'd be a priority free agent for my team, as he did have some very solid games. I would just question how they translate. And last but not least, to wrap things up here at number 98, we have DJ Dale. Now, Dale is the epitome of a guy that I would be looking for in, I'll say it again, right there, that 7th round, or really in particular as a UDFA. I think that's really where his value could come. You get a guy who has had, quite a bit of big game experience rotating in and out there at Alabama. He's certainly well coached. You can't take anything away from him in that regard. Just doesn't quite have the athletic intangibles, I think, to ever really be that next level starter at the league, particularly as a pass rusher. I think better as a run defender. If you need a couple reps at one tech every game, he can fill in. Do I expect him to do that at the next level, especially off the bat? Not really. He feels like someone who's just going to be a good influence and someone that's useful to have on your roster, in particular for the Monday through Saturday of it, right? He feels like someone who could make your offensive line better and kind of, have an iron sharpen iron impact and provide a quality body to your roster to kind of round out the back end of your team. But past that, someone that I just didn't quite think, again, similar to a couple of these other guys, I just didn't quite think that athleticism was there, even at that defensive tackle position. So, with that said, ladies and gentlemen, the last thing to say, you see it on the screen right there, is thank you for watching. Much longer video than I expected, but hopefully you guys enjoyed. Obviously, put a lot of work in this draft process, graded the most prospects I've ever done, and I might not even be done yet. There might be a couple additions here that I make. Just wanted to get this video ready a little bit in advance. I know going to be spamming you guys on draft day again, which I apologize for to an extent, but at the same time I don't, because it's a lot of frickin' content that I hope is good and enjoyable. So don't expect you guys to watch it all by any means, but hopefully going to attract people who don't know much about guys their team just drafted, like we always do here on the channel. I will say, I'm going to try and be a little bit more active going forward. I'd like to maybe do some stuff for the 2024 draft pretty early in the process here. One big problem that I have is I'm constantly tinkering with grades, and I constantly have that urge to watch more games, right? I'll watch 4 games for a guy and give him an early cut preliminary grade, but then say a Felix Anudike-Uzomah, you watch 2 more, and it's like, well, that needs to go up. And then it's like, well, I could put a video out, or I could wait another month and watch another one, and then the grade goes up, and it's like, oh man, a good thing I didn't put a video out, but should I watch another one? And you just keep going down that. So for me, being someone where the grades are the most important thing and getting this order as right as I can, it's tough to put guys out through the process, but might take you guys on that process a little bit more with me next year. Time permitting and things of that nature. We'll have to cross that road when we get there, though. I also want to add in, I don't really expect anybody to be here and watch all the way through this video, but in case you did, obviously, tell me down below. Tell me what your thoughts were. Did you enjoy? Did you not enjoy? Why? And if you want to see an individual video on anybody in particular here, I'll do it. I'll break them down a little bit further. We'll put some tape on, at least in the background, although I do have cut-ups of pretty much everybody to which I was planning to try and make some Q-rated videos like you're going to see some of here later this draft day, but wasn't able to do it for all of them, so in others we just have film rolling in the background regardless. So let me know what you would like to see. Don't know if I'm going to get around to a video for everybody, right? So hey, if your team drafted Aubrey Miller Jr. and you're saying, hey, Michael, your 25 seconds you gave him wasn't enough, I'll make a video for him after the draft if you guys would like. Just comment that down below, and I'll be more than willing to make a video on every single guy I have listed here. Or even if I didn't list a guy here, that doesn't mean the curiosity is gone. I know the offensive line prospects is a big reason some of you have subscribed in the past. Those tend to be my best videos view-wise. So in that regard, a little bit disappointing that I wasn't able to get around to them this year, but I'm not just going to rush through and artificially grade guys for the sake of pumping out content. For me, again, the grades come prior to the content always and forever. So with that said, that really is all I have for you guys in this one. Hopefully you enjoyed this big board extravaganza extraordinaire here, breaking down and discussing how I rank the 98 guys I watched this draft process. And yeah, with that said, that's pretty much all I got for you guys. I'm mic'd up. Now I'm mic'ing out. Peace, guys. See you next time.